Well, hello and welcome back to the Preaching While Black podcast, a podcast committed to the call, the craft, and the content context of the Black preaching tradition. I'm your host, Pastor John Richards. I am the Connections Pastor here in St. Mark Baptist Church in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I have a great guest this go round. It's my brother, Pastor Edrin Williams, who I actually met for the first time at EK Bailey, but have heard of the great work that he's doing in Minneapolis. And I just had to have him on the podcast. So let's go ahead and go into this episode. It's going to be a good one.
Welcome to the Preaching While Black podcast, a podcast dedicated to the calling, craft, and content of the Black preaching tradition. And now, here's your host, John C. Richards Jr.
Pastor Edrin Williams, what's going on, man? How you doing?
I'm good, Pastor John. How are you, brother?
Man, I'm doing great, man. Doing great. Good to have you on the podcast. We have acquaintances who know each of us individually, but have connected us on different levels. So I'm glad to be able to connect with you and have this conversation, man. Can't wait to jump into it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, man. I appreciate you and some of those mutual friends that we have speak very highly of you. And in fact, one, Pastor Seth, who's here with us at Sanctuary, says you and John, you should talk. You guys would get each other. So I'm excited to get to know you a little bit better and share a little bit of my story.
Love that, man. And we're both fellow Southerners, man. You're from my neighboring state in South Carolina. You know, I'm from Georgia. But listen, you might be the one guest who has the smallest amount of people in his hometown. You're from Bowman, South Carolina.
Right.
Bowman, South Carolina, which is close to, in proximity to a larger city, which is Charleston, right? But now, last census count, Edrin, Pastor Edrin, the count was 769 people in Bowman. 769.
Right. You know, the funny thing is, I'm like, first of all, a good 200 of those are my family members, probably. And it was a little bit bigger when I was there. I've been here in Minnesota almost 20 years now, but it was a little bit bigger when I lived there. But it is a really small town. Wow.
So small town guy. And now you are the lead pastor of Sanctuary Covenant Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We're going to talk about the journey to getting there.
Yeah,
but you definitely have an undergrad in African American Studies and U.S. History from the University of South Carolina. Us Georgia fans ain't going to hold that against you, but it's fine. It's fine. And then an MDiv from Bethel Seminary in preaching and communications. And so we're going to talk about that journey and talk about that. But tell me about your personal life, man. Married, children?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, born and raised in Bowman, South Carolina, in the Low Country, small town, about 45 minutes outside of Charleston. And so proud Gullah Geechee people. That's who I am. That's a part of my culture, my story. I met my wife, Shaniqua, at the University of South Carolina. And we, after she graduated, we relocated here to the Twin Cities back in 2005. And we were planning to be here about 3 years. And here we are 19 years later, still here in the Twin Cities. And it's been really good to us. And we'll talk more about the ministry journey and all that. I have two daughters, Taylor, who is 14 and is a ninth grader, just started ninth grade. And then we waited a while and had a second, Harper, who is 7, about to be 8 in a couple of weeks. She is a second grader. And so the four of us are here in the Twin Cities. We had no family here. When we got here, we knew 2 people in the entire state, but it really has become home. And my ministry and my relationship to the church has been a huge part of that.
So you got you a busy household over there, man.
Right. we are quite busy, and it helps though, because it's so cold here, man. If you don't have something to do, you're going to go crazy. So I
stir crazy.
Something to do.
Yeah, we lived in Chicago for a while, so I definitely understand that, brother. I definitely understand that. Now, we generally start with the call story for a lot of our pastors who are on the podcast. I'm always intrigued at how people feel called to ministry. And my understanding is, Pastor Edrin, that you didn't have this desire to be a preacher growing up.
No.
And then you went on to undergrad. You were like African American studies, U.S.
Right.
history. So
Right.
none of that says preaching to me, at least on paper.
Right.
So how did you get from there to now being a lead pastor of a church in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in terms of your call to ministry?
I like you said, man, I grew up in church. Spent my whole life in church. There in Bowman, we didn't have a whole lot of anything else to do. And then my particular family was pretty poor, man. We didn't have a whole lot. And so we really did. The church was at the center of our lives. And so I'm talking, my grandmother was a leader in our church, missionary, chair of the church treasurer. My granddad was the what they call the sexton. So he took care of the church, drove the Sunday school bus, opened the church on Sunday, locked it up when people were done. And so we would be at church 5-6 days a week. And that's just like year round. We didn't have a whole lot else to do. But for me, that really gave me a deep love and appreciation for the church. The church was a safe place for me. And so that was really like woven into me from the very beginning. But I was also a very good student, always had good grades, and was surrounded by a lot of leadership opportunities. And so for me, went to the University of South Carolina, actually first to study biology. Really thought I wanted to go on and be a doctor. My younger sister is 4 years younger, has cerebral palsy. And so we spent a lot of time in hospitals related to her health as I was growing up. And so had a deep, deep love and appreciation for medical professionals, thought I wanted to do that. Then went to undergrad and realized like I didn't love the sciences in a way that would make me keep getting beat up by those science classes in those labs. But I'd always had an appreciation and love for history. And so started studying history. And that really was like formative for me in not just my studies, but my identity as a Black person. Dr. Cleveland Sellers was an African-American studies professor there. He was the director of the program, became a mentor of mine. Bakari Sellers, who's on CNN, is his son. And
I was going to ask if he was related to Bakari. I'm like, South Carolina's got to be Bakari Sellers' connection.
Right. So Dr. Sellers, he's a civil rights legend, and he took me under his wing. And so I switched my major from biology to African-American studies and U.S. history, and wanted to go on and teach African-American studies, teach history, and become a college president. That was the trajectory that I was on. And so when I finished undergrad, I started a master's program at the University of South Carolina. Wanted to go on and get my PhD in history and then teach, like I said. But it was around early in my undergrad years where I got called to ministry. Had grown up in church, had a deep appreciation for the church, had seen all the areas of leadership and service in the church. But preaching was sort of a part of it that I didn't have that. When you meet a lot of people who are pastors and preachers, they have this attraction to preaching in the pulpit. I didn't have that. I was actually different in the fact that I almost was, I was afraid of it in some ways. I had such a high regard for preachers and pastors that it was hard for me to see myself in that place. My pastor growing up was Reverend Dr. S.B. Marshall, who was a giant of a man. He was a big guy. And you've met, I'm 6'5", about 3. I'm not a little dude. He was my size. He had this huge baritone voice. And so as a little kid, I just remember looking up to him and that voice. And I didn't know if I could do what he was doing. And so I didn't really allow myself to imagine that. I really wanted to go on and make my way as a teacher, as a professor, and then as a college president, but had a call to ministry early in my undergrad career that I hid from everybody. I thought I was hiding it. And the Lord was gracious and let me run from that call to ministry for a little bit. And then he just sort of yanked my chain, and he was gracious in that way. And when I shared it with my family and my friends, my fraternity brothers, they all were like, of course, we knew it. We knew that already. And so I wasn't very good at hiding it. But it for me was very different than what I had wanted for myself. But it all makes sense now looking back. And even in how I do ministry, how I preach now, that historian, that desire to help people, that desire to educate, that sort of bringing together the history of our people and the story of struggle and liberation and God's work of liberation in the world, it all weaves together in a beautiful way.
That's so good, man. So the undergrad degree was helpful for you even in your
Absolutely.
ministry work, which is great.
Absolutely.
Yes, good,
Absolutely.
man. So let me ask you this about your call, because
Mhm.
we often talk about the call to preach, especially
Right.
preachers. Like, when you feel that call to preach, but there's also in some people this call to lead.
Right.
Like, you feel like there's a call to lead people,
Right.
lead God's flock as a shepherd.
Right.
We often talk about the call to preach, but not necessarily the call to pastor. I was telling
Right.
somebody the other day, a lot of people want to have a church, but they don't want to have the people.
Right. Right.
And so
Right.
what I'm sensing from you in our conversations is that alongside the preaching call, there was this call to say, man, I have a leadership gift that I want to be able to give to Christ's body. So
Right.
talk about that call to lead. How do you feel like that shaped up for you as a young man from Bowman, South Carolina?
Yeah, it really, I think you say it perfectly, man. There's this call to preach, and this desire to preach that many people have. But there's also other calls that we see in the scriptures, and the one that I most resonate with is this call to lead people. There's also this idea of strategic leadership. I think about the Old Testament passage. I think it's in Chronicles, the men of Issachar who understood the times and knew what should be done. I think God has just blessed me with an idea or a gift of being able to organize people and things, like strategic vision for here's where we want to go. Here's some ways that we can organize ourselves, how we might approach this and get it done in a way that both honors who we are and honors the vision as well. And so I would say I'm a leader first. I'm a pastoral leader. I think of myself as a visionary leader of a church. And one part of that, one important part, but only one part of that, is that I get to preach as a part of that. So preaching is a tool that I use to lead the people that God has called me to lead in this season. And so for me, when I think about the preaching moment on a Sunday, and I think some ways this makes me maybe not the mainstream for preachers, particularly preachers of churches of a certain size. Like, I love preaching, but I know it's not the only thing I'm responsible for. I'm also responsible for ensuring that we have, even if I'm not the one doing it myself, like instruction and discipleship happening beyond Sunday. I'm also responsible for making sure that there is care happening for people beyond Sundays, because life happens for people all the time. And an incredible sermon is a part of encouraging people and strengthening them, but it's not the only thing that a church needs to be healthy and functional. And there's also a part where there's a business or organizational aspect of the church where the church needs to be organized well, or what's going to happen is people are going to slip through the cracks. People's needs are going to go unmet. And if I only am focused on, man, how am I going to get into that sermon? How am I going to make them holler? And then how I'm going to sit down? Like, there's some other things that are important to the life of the church that get missed. And so I want to bring together the best of pastoral leadership, and I see preaching as one of the primary tools that the Lord has given me to be able to do that.
Now, Pastor Edrin, somebody on here is saying, now, you know, I spend about 30 hours a week working on my message.
Yes,
Now
sir.
you telling me I got to delve into discipleship. I got to go into strategic planning. I got to go into budgets. I got to go. They didn't teach
Right,
me this stuff in seminary. So
right,
how am I supposed to preach well
right,
and lead well?
right. I think very practically, I want to clarify for that person. I'm not saying you have to do all those things. I think as the senior pastor of your particular church, it's your job to ensure all those things are happening and happening effectively. In fact, a part of leadership is learning to delegate, learning to raise up and delegate parts of the work. Um, and I think you will be a happier, more long lasting pastor if you can learn, here are the parts of this that I'm really good at, but how do I make sure the rest of the things are happening as well? And so when I say here's what this looks like for me, I'm saying because of my particular gift set, because of my particular interests, I know preaching is a part of what I get to do, but it serves a broader purpose. Like, I don't weigh the success of my week on how well the sermon went. It's one part of the whole of what I get to do, and it served me well. It served me well.
That's good, man. Eric Geiger in his book Designed to Lead talks about the leadership distinctions between Moses and the person that follows him.
Right.
And so Joshua, he says Joshua didn't have a succession plan.
Mm-hmm.
And as you can see, after Joshua, you don't see strong leadership.
Right.
He said Moses did, but Joshua did not. And I think one of the things about the church context is we generally love preaching, but we don't like developing other leaders. And especially in our church context, Black church context, oftentimes the churches die with the leadership, with the pastor, because there hasn't been an adequate development of leadership. Yeah. Quick question for you. How would you encourage a pastor who is wanting to do more leadership, but doesn't feel like they have the leadership gift to be able to do it?
Right. It really is. I think 1 Corinthians 12, looking at the fact that if Christ has built the church and Christ is in charge of the church, he has equipped the church with what it needs. You don't have to have all the gifts, but you can trust by God's grace, the gifts that the church needs it's there. You just need to, I think, there's a certain humility that I think comes with effective pastoring, to realize that there is gifting in the church that goes beyond you. One of the things I love most about my work here at Sanctuary is I've been able to surround myself with other gifted pastors. I'm not the kind of person where there's only room for one good pastor. And I'm not Pastor King, like a pastor / king or whatever. Like, I feel there are other people around me who are effective pastors themselves, and we get to do this together. Yes, there are certain parts that I own and feel responsible for, but we do it together. And so I would say, even if you don't have a pastor staff, look at the ways in which through your elders, your deacons, or others, or other folks in the congregation who might have a desire to serve as lay ministers, look at the ways together you all are gifted for ministry, and see what happens, what you have in front of you there.
That's good. So, Pastor Edrin, we discussed your call a little bit. I want to talk about the craft a little bit, craft of your preaching. You're Bethel trained seminarian. You have your MDiv in preaching and homiletics. So we got to go into the craft just a little bit. Let's go ahead and take a little break, and then we'll be right back after this break.
Scholars have referred to the original Black church as the invisible institution because enslaved people were often not allowed to worship freely. They'd have to gather, sing, and preach in secret to avoid being beaten. Yet they still developed a deep devotion to the authority of Scripture and the liberation narrative. Today, many Christians who don't fully agree with conservatives or progressives feel invisible. They're not well represented in politics or mainstream media. In response, the AND campaign has created the Invisible Institution newsletter, or IVI. We'll be providing political commentary, policy breakdowns, and more for Christians who believe in social justice and moral order, not one or the other. Go to andcampaign.org and subscribe if you're sick and tired of feeling invisible.
All right, so let's go ahead and dig into the craft of preaching. So, Pastor Edrin, take me through. First of all, at Sanctuary, do you all have a teaching team, or are you teaching every week?
No. One of the gifts of being here at Sanctuary is that we get to do team preaching, and actually, we're doing something that I would say is unique in some ways. So one of the mutual friends that we have together, you and I, how I got to know you, is through Pastor Seth Martin, who is a young minister here in the Twin Cities from Arkansas. Loves St. Mark. We talk about St. Mark almost every day in some context, and just has a deep love for St. Mark and his ministry and his legacy. He's a product of St. Mark. And we got to know each other through ministry here in the city, and just really became close friends, and would get together monthly, encourage each other, talk through ministry stuff. He would come and preach my pastor's anniversary. And I took a sabbatical last year for the first time in my ministry, had an opportunity to take about 3.5 months away. And because his church was meeting on Saturday nights, I invited him to come in and preach for me a couple times a month while I was gone. And he and I had already been dreaming about and always talking about, man, why does it feel like everybody needs to do ministry by themselves, and there can only be one like gifted preacher in a church staff, and all this kind of stuff. We would always raise those kind of questions, and it really became obvious to us that God was opening a door for us to consider doing something together. And so Pastor Seth came onto our team last year, and the church, the work that he was leading, they came and joined our church as well. And we share most of the preaching. And so between him and I, we do most of the preaching, probably about 80% of the preaching between us. And so that for me allows me to still lead the church, guide the church, have my preaching voice be one of the most regular voices that they hear. But it also allows me to invite in someone who I know loves Jesus, loves the word, loves the church, is committed to many of the same things I'm committed to. And he's doing another heavy lift of the preaching. And then we have a couple sisters on our team who are pastors, Pastor Rose, Pastor Jen. They preach as a part of our regular rotation as well. And so our church, which is an urban multi-ethnic church, gets a diversity of voices and styles and presentations. And when it all comes together, it's something beautiful that I couldn't have planned by myself, and I certainly couldn't do by myself. And so I'm honored that other quality preachers would come and join our team, and our congregation is made better because of how we share in that preaching responsibility.
So for those who are thinking through what a team teaching preaching model looks like, and they're thinking about, man, I usually do all my sermon prep by myself. I'm in my study, closed off in the corner, have no collaboration happening. It's just me and the Lord and the Holy Spirit, and we're trying to get this thing done. What type of collaborative work does that call for when you're doing a team preaching model like that, especially when you're preaching series and you have to continue a series based on what someone preached before or what someone's going to preach after?
Right. I think the first part and the biggest part of the work is in the formation of the sermon schedule for the course of the year. And so as a lead, I usually drive that process of coming up with our theme for the year. Pastor Seth and I are actually right now working on shaping and crafting the 2025 preaching schedule. And then we'll get together as a full preaching team and fill in many of the gaps, fleshing out series ideas and specific sermon ideas. Then I'll go back and assign certain weeks to certain people. But we also have the gift of, because life happens and stuff comes up, like being able to step in and fill in for each other. I think the beauty of it, and the part that is still being figured out for us, because we're literally 10 months into this sort of new team teaching model. The part that we're still trying to figure out is how to involve each other in the week to week preparation of our sermon on the front end. And then also creating space to share with each other in the feedback loop of here's what worked, what didn't work, and being able to speak into it that way. And I think as we figured that out, that's probably actually going to be the richest part of it. Because again, you're bringing not just four sets of eyes to the table, you're also bringing like life experiences and stories and wonderings and all of that. And I think if we can figure it out, it'll make all of us richer preachers through that process. And so I'm excited to figure that piece out with them.
Yeah, one of the things that we rarely talk about in this process, especially with team teaching, is even the role of the Spirit, even if you aren't having conversations with one another.
Right.
Like when you follow somebody and you're like, man, they're hitting on something that I'm going to follow up on next week. And it just makes it cohesive. And like how the Holy Spirit guides that, right?
It's beautiful. And I think there is also something that I've certainly appreciated of, I'll preach one week and one of the others will go in the second week, and something that was certainly meaningful for me, and I intentionally put it in there, but it wasn't like maybe the main point of something. They'll grab that. That's something the Holy Spirit like illuminated for them. They'll grab it and pick up from there and push it a little bit farther. It really is a cool experience, man. And it reminds me of the fact that in preaching, there's our work and then there's the Spirit's work. Like we certainly study, we certainly prepare, we take it seriously, we give our best to it, but you have no idea what part of a message the Spirit will use to connect to a person or what's going on in a certain person's life that you think, ooh, this is going to be the part that most impacts them. And it's something completely different. And so it really does, again, to go back to that idea of humility, like you realize like, man, it's not just me. It's just not just how like fresh I am with a certain idea or how clear I am in a certain point. There is my part, but there's also a fact that I'm joining with God in what God's doing.
You know, just like you said, it's always the throw-ins that the Spirit will light up.
Right.
Like
right.
I throw in an illustration, I'm like, all right, this is going to work here. And then somebody
Right.
comes up to me afterwards, like, I really need to hear you tell that story because it made the text come alive. And I'm like,
Right. Right.
thank you, Holy Ghost.
Right,
so just
right.
his role in that team teaching model, it should be encouraging to folks who want to try it, because
Yeah.
sometimes I think we feel like, well, it's not going to be cohesive because it's different people. Man,
Right.
listen, you got 4 gospel accounts.
Right. Right. I think people lose sight of just how, like, even the canon, the text that we have, the Bible, like how many writers, how many books written over how many hundreds of years,
Yeah.
different places, different situation, but it comes together in a beautiful way that we would even call it a book. It's wild that we would even call the Bible a book.
Right.
So
Right.
God can
What
do
other
that.
book do you know with that many authors across that many languages, across that
Right.
many generations? It
Right.
just
So if God can do that with the scriptures, he certainly can do that with your sermon series.
yeah, right. So let's talk about some of the things that you use part of your craft. Now, are you manuscript preacher, outline preacher? How do you approach
Yeah,
your
so
preaching on
I
Sunday?
am I would consider myself a outline preacher, but before I get there, I'm manuscripting it all out. And so typically what I'll have with me in the pulpit, I preach from an iPad. I know there's some people who I don't carry anything in the pulpit. There's some people who are like, I carry paper only because I've had a device malfunction and that kind of thing. So I'll preach from my iPad, and it's usually my outline, key points, like sub points under each. And then depending on maybe the introduction or the closing, I'll do some notation to make sure I get the key points or marks that I want to hit on that. But for me, it also depends on where I'm preaching and what I'm doing. I'm open to other things as well. As a former youth pastor, like I feel like I always have a sermon on me, and I'm always working on a sermon. And so if I need to, I can get up and go. I try not to do that very often. I try not to do that. Let me say it that way. But if I were ever called up, like I've been at my home church, sometimes you go to an event,
for sure.
they're like, come
It
on
happens.
up and preach. Let's go to Psalm 23.
Any good black preacher, when you go home, you better have something ready.
Right.
I went to my grandmother's home church in South Carolina and was just visiting.
Right.
And the man, he got up in the pulpit getting ready to preach. And he was like, well, we got another preacher in the house.
Right.
Come on up and deliver the word. And I'm like,
Last
I always got to be ready, man. Always got to be ready.
You better.
So talk to me about your storytelling within your sermon. You have an outline, you have a point there, but do you tell the story with eye contact so you make sure you're getting the story entrenched in people, not necessarily making sure it's detailed, like I got to get every word right? How does your storytelling play out in the craft that you're preaching?
So for me, man, storytelling is one of the primary things I love to have included in my sermons, because I think there is a necessary part of sort of that proclamation and didactic aspect. But there's a piece of, for me, one of my goals in preaching is not just to tell people what the text says, not even just to tell them what it means, but to talk about what difference it makes and what now do you do as a result of this truth that we've been presented. And so I love using stories. I love using illustrations from either literature or pop culture, from movies, from songs, whatever, to sort of put handles on eternal truth. I want people to be able to take this with them. I also think there's sort of this. I would call it in some ways like a trick for me. I point to everyday things and use that as a visible reminder of some truth in the Bible, because I want people to be constantly reminded of biblical truth no matter where they are and what they're doing. Um, we did a series a few years back from a book called Jesus Outlaw, and one of the books was that one of the thoughts in chapters in the book was that that Jesus was like radically fun. Like Jesus knew how to have fun and throw a party. And it was drawn from the place of the wedding at Cana. And so I did an illustration. I actually brought like some red cups on stage with me.
The
Um,
solo red cups.
Solo red
Yes,
cups,
sir.
solo
Yes,
cups.
sir.
And I used those at a certain point um, of the sermon, and it was an encouragement that we should be red cup Christians, in the sense that we should bring joy, we should bring laughter, we should bring peace wherever we go. I've had people say like they can't look at a red solo cup without thinking about that sermon, and I'm like, I got you, like like
Exactly. Yep.
that's my point. And so I believe I can use almost anything to point to some biblical truth, some scriptural truth, and that if I can help people make that connection, that truth is lasting and transformational long beyond the sermon. And so I use a lot of stories in my introduction. I'll use a story at the introduction, and I'll go through the rest of the sermon, and then I'll come back to the story at the end, and as a way of tying it all together. And I love the way, again, I'll have my idea of how it's going to look and sound and feel, and often the Holy Spirit will pull it together in a way that far exceeded even what I had in mind to do with it, and it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, it's good, man. It's good. So outside of the Bible,
hmm
what are your top 3 go-to resources
hmm
in
I would
sermon prep?
say uh, I watch a lot of stand-up comedy. I think comedians are the best communicators in the culture. I think a stand-up comic can make you laugh, cry, and think deeply in a matter of 45 seconds. And so I draw a lot from sort of their use of language, their use of timing, pacing, their way of looking at almost anything in the world and drawing something out of it. And so I watch a lot of stand up comedy. I also, of course, just this is old school, but like just a newspaper. I have a daily newspaper that comes because I'm always looking for stories of what's happening in our city and our world, that in some way would resonate with what's happening in whatever the text is that we're preaching at the time. The one that I'm like more new in using, and I'm sure for you, who this is what you do as well, you probably have at least leaned into it in some sense of trying to get a sense of how it works. I've like really enjoyed having AI as a resource, particularly around research. It's been a helpful tool for me because I feel like I have the most talented research assistant in the world, um, and so it gives me ideas, it gives me thoughts, it gives me a way to engage with way more resources than I would on my own in a given space and time. And so I'm still in the early end of like figuring out how best to use it for what I want to do, but I certainly am learning from other pastors how AI can be a helpful source, even in sermon prep.
That's good to hear, man. For you pastors out there, AI is not the devil.
Right,
It is certain,
right,
like any other tool you use, it could be used for
right,
God's glory and used in a way that's ethical as well, I
right,
believe.
right.
So,
And that's important. That's important
yeah.
because I've heard some horror stories of people who will let it preach their whole sermon and all, or at least write their whole sermon and that kind of stuff. And I'm like, no, that's a whole nother thing. Like there's certainly a clear start and stop for me of how I'm using it, and I think it is worth it for us to at least like dig into it and see what's there.
Yeah, we're about to move into our last session, but I got one last question for you because we're both
Yeah.
getting older.
Yeah.
Pastor Edrin. And so how do you, when you get these stories that you're collecting from newspapers, how do you store them, recall them, have them ready to go for in your phone?
Right.
Okay.
In my phone. Like it's in my notes app or in my I also keep a little notebook with me at all time, and I'm either jotting it down there and transferring it to notes later, or I'm putting it directly into notes. And
Yeah.
again, like I'm always working on a sermon whether I know it or not. Whether I'm preaching that week or not, I'm seeing something that reminds me of something else. And the benefit of how we do sermon prep here, like if I wanted to know what I was going to be preaching about, right now, and I can tell you what I'm going to be preaching between now and next June. And so I'm constantly like observing, looking, learning, hearing other sermons. I study other preachers. I love good preaching. If I'm driving in my car, I'm probably listening to somebody preach about something. And so I really do take it upon myself to learn from the people who do it well. So including your pastor, who's one of the best in my opinion.
Yes, Dr. Philip Pointer is a whole problem, man.
Right.
So preachers, I need y'all to hear this. Don't depend on your memory.
Mm-hmm.
Write down anything that comes to mind. Use that notes app. Use whatever you have available, because when you lose it, you're going to be real mad about losing that best illustration that you thought up.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. So we've discussed your call. We've discussed the craft of your preaching. We're going to talk about the context of your preaching here on the other side. Take a break. We'll be right back. What's up, Preaching While Black fam? Listen, I hope this interview has been a blessing so far. If you want more content and resources around Preaching While Black, go over to our YouTube channel at Preaching While Black. We have all the episodes from our interviews up, but we also have other resources for you as a Black preacher as you try to hone your craft, your call, and your content for Black preaching. Now back to our episode. All right, man, let's talk about the context, the content of your preaching. And this is really interesting with regard to you and where you are in terms of social location. Janine Brown talks about the importance of social location in her book, Scripture's Communication. And so you're from South Carolina.
From South Carolina.
Small town, less than 1,000 people.
Less than 800 people.
Right. I was just trying to help you out, man. I'm trying to give you 4 figures at least. You wind up in Minneapolis thinking you're there for school, and now you're entrenched in that community, firmly entrenched in that community as a leader, as a pastor. Ironically, your undergrad degree is in African American history. And just the history piece is what's getting at me, because I'm not sure you thought that you would become part of what has become part of African American history in Minneapolis in 2020. When we all saw the video with George Floyd, we saw what happened in Minneapolis around that time, and you're pastoring in the city at that time.
Right.
And so I have to ask you, have you think through, especially as someone who's pastoring a multi-ethnic congregation, a Black pastor leading folks who don't look like you.
Right.
And so we see the video, we see the fallout from it. As a pastor, how are you personally processing that in that moment? And then two, from a leadership perspective, because I know you love leadership. From a leadership perspective, what are you thinking the next steps are in a moment like that?
Yeah, that really was and remains one of the most pivotal moments of my life, of my pastorate, and the history of our church. For context, we're in 2020. What you're referring to, we're in a global pandemic, so we've been unable to meet in person from middle of March, and now we're end of May, Memorial Day weekend. And I remember in the evening news on that Memorial Day weekend, that Memorial Day night, just a little blurb from the news reporter that a a man had died in police custody that day, had some sort of medical episode is how they first reported it. And the sad thing is that happens so often that it wasn't a big deal when the storyline first came out. What was different was that there was a video this time, and what the video showed was what we now know was murder. Police kneeling on a man's neck and him screaming and asking for help and them not offering him help and then him ultimately dying. And with everything that was going on in the world because of the pandemic and people locked at home and all the questions and the fears and the uneasiness in the world, then this happens. It's like throwing gas on a fire, and things erupted here in the city. We're about 10 minutes away from where George Floyd was killed, on the north side of the city, just north of downtown. And we're in what is now the sort of the black part of Minneapolis, the part, if you're thinking west side or south side of Chicago, you're thinking Decatur in Atlanta, the Baltimore. It's the part that where there's a lot of struggle already. And our church is 22 years old right now. And we are, like, from the very beginning, have sought to not only just come and have church here, but to be in the community, to serve the community. Biblical justice is at the core of who we are. And so for 20 years, we've done the work of like standing up for justice and holding police and others accountable for injustice, and standing and speaking up for a community when they don't have anybody to speak up for them. And so we were used to being in a place of responding to things like this, but even we didn't know that this would be what it became. And so almost overnight, our city changed and people were angrier than I'd ever seen them before. And so in that moment, one, as a church, preaching aside, we did what we knew to do, which was when things get hard, we just draw towards the community. And so we started pulling out our grills, like serving food to the community, handing out bottles of water. There were all these various large gatherings coming and protests being held, and we just served the community through that, and that ministry of presence and being creating spaces of peace. That was like our initial work. Again, we thought it would be short-lived. We didn't know how long any of this would last, but the more things went on, the more we realized this was not a normal moment. And so that Sunday immediately after, like we didn't give a huge, like I didn't shift my sermon for that particular week. But I did do sort of again, we're meeting online. So I recorded a piece that we put at the start of our service to acknowledge what happened, talk about the ways we were going to try to serve the community and go from there. But I remember deeply feeling like my preaching needs to be something that people can look to for a sense of hope and encouragement, but also for just the ability to name that there's something wrong with what's going on right now. I feel like there's such a need to just, like, people don't expect us to solve all the problems. People just sometimes expect us to name the fact that something is wrong with this situation. And the fact of somebody being viewed as so invaluable that you would hold your knee on their neck until they take their last breath, there's something wrong with that. And I just really felt like, hey, even if this were for some reason to get me in trouble, I'm just going to name there's something wrong with this. And then from there, I just began to like find ways to encourage our people to let's continue to be the church. Let's show up. Let's not let it be said of the church that we didn't show up for the community or we didn't raise our eyes against injustice. And some of the work and the reputation of our church landed me on like CBS Evening News and national news, other national news outlets, speaking to the BBC in Europe and interviewing with churches across the globe and that kind of stuff. And some of it was like, I'm just doing what I feel like I should be doing say our life matters. There's something wrong with snatching somebody's life this way. Uh, the kingdom of God is something very different than what we're seeing play out here. And so I was at times surprised by how much people were interested in like interviewing and talking about that, because like churches are often not mainstreamed in that way. But we were just for some reason given the opportunity to keep telling that story, keep having those conversations, and our ministry is still in some ways like hearing from people who first, and many people even came to join our church because of it, because of the ministry they saw us have during the pandemic and in the death of George Floyd. And so it really was a crazy thing. And I don't know, man, my preaching, I always, Dr. King is one of my favorites. And I always wonder, like, man, if I ever had to step up and speak into a moment like he did, would I have the words? And I think of them being eloquent words and beautiful and poetic like he does. But I didn't do anything like magical. I just kept naming the fact that there's something broken about this world. And then there's the kingdom of God, which offers us something different, a different way, and then calling the church to follow that. And people responded.
It's really good, man. And I appreciate you all for stepping up in that moment. Like when
Yeah,
people need hope like that, man, it's good to see the church step up, and probably other churches in the area did the same as
right,
you all. So
right,
it's just a good thing and good practice when we have unrest like that, and you have people
right,
who are frustrated. That
right,
man, when they're looking for a glimmer of hope, we got the
right.
greatest hope in the world in the gospel. And
It's
so
right there. It's baked in. So,
just be who Jesus would have been.
right, right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, question for you, man.
Yep.
What are your biggest frustrations as a black pastor of a multi-ethnic church? And then the follow-up question is, what brings you the greatest joy of
Yeah.
being a black pastor of a multi-ethnic church?
You know, it's amazing the timing of that question. Because Pastor Seth and I were just having a conversation yesterday, and I'm going to be completely honest. One of my biggest frustrations right now is that there is not a pipeline of young leaders who are like waiting to take my place. like they're just there are people who are very interested in preaching. There are people who are very interested in having a platform to talk about social justice, but there isn't there isn't a stream, in my opinion, of people who actually care about like holistic ministry and who are willing to like be resilient and take the lumps of what comes with pastoring a multi-ethnic church or a church in the city. Like it's the glitz and the glamour of preaching and that kind of stuff that draws people in. And the first time you get punched in the face by real life ministry, people are like, "Nah, I'm good. I'm gonna go work for Apple. Like I'm gonna go drive Uber or something." And
That's
so
real.
it's that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
No, that's real, man. That's
Yeah.
real. So that's one of
So
the things that
that's the
frustrates
big
you.
frustration. The joy for me is the hope that I have, and that's often represented in the beauty and the energy of the next generation, like seeing the teens and the children of our church. They give me hope. They remind me what this is about. They even remind me that there was a time where I was a kid and there was some adult who invested, who was faithful, who prayed, who worked so that I could be doing what I'm doing now. And I feel like responsible to do the same for the next generation. We had back to school Sunday a couple weeks ago, man, and it was my absolute honor just to pray over our kids before they went to school. And we had planned for them to come and stand in front of the stage, and I pray for them from there. But one little girl, her name is Journey. She's a natural leader, and wherever she goes, there's a line of kids following behind her. And so she walked up to the stairs like she was going to come up on the stage. And I was like, come on up. And so she came up on the stage and all the other kids followed her. And so there's like pictures or videos of like me surrounded by all of those kids praying for them and then praying for our teachers and our educators. And it was a highlight of my week and of the last couple of months, man. Like, ministry is hard. It's challenging. There are many seasons where you work, and you don't get to see the immediate fruit of it. But every now and then, God gives you a glimpse of something that reminds you of his faithfulness and reminds you of his promise. And those moments, you capture those moments because it sustains you for the rest of what comes along with being a pastor. And so I love the fact of being able to look at our kids, look at the next generation, and know that even if they don't all become pastors, there's probably a pastor in the crowd. There's somebody who's like going to go into corporate America and live out their faith really well. There's somebody who's going to go into business or be a lawyer or a doctor and live out their faith well. And that encourages me.
Man, let me tell you something. This has been rich. And this interview has been evidence that sometimes South Carolina Gamecock fans get it right. Man, and I just want to commend you for that.
Except when we're playing Georgia, right?
No, man, seriously, Pastor Edrin, this has been rich, man. I really appreciate the work that you're doing in Minneapolis. Appreciate your leadership and you're willing to lead as a pastor. That's a very rare gift in the preaching communities for someone who wants to be able to lean into leading. So just grateful for you, man, and praying God's blessing on you and the people at Sanctuary.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. And thank you for creating this platform. I see a lot of platforms like this in other communities. I'm glad that you're creating it for the Black church, from the Black church, with a love for the Black church. That is a rare gift. And so thank you for what you do, man. Keep up the great work.
Appreciate it, man. Well, thank y'all for joining us for this episode of the Preaching While Black podcast. Looking forward to you all joining us next episode as we continue to talk to young leaders and old leaders who continue to work for and about the Black church. Grace and peace.
Thanks for listening to the Preaching While Black podcast. For more helpful content and resources, connect with us online at preachingwhileblack.com.